Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our reading of Meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply value your support. Please like and share this audiobook to reach a wider audience, allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ensuring you receive immediate notifications as we upload new content. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community of enlightenment and inner peace. Thank you for being part of our journey to make these profound teachings accessible to all. Let's start today with reading. Act of Truth. April 7, 2005. The Buddha had a very active sense of the truth. True things on the conditioned level, he said, don't exist in isolation, they're part of a causal chain. They come from previous and coexisting conditions, and they act conditions that come after them or together with them. And as for the truths we talk about, the truths that can be taught, those are active, too. They have an impact on the person who talks about them, and on the person who listens. They lead to certain kinds of actions. Because of this, the Buddha said that something that was false could not be useful, in the genuine sense of the term. There's a passage where he talks about different kinds of speech. Speech that's true but not useful, speech that's true and useful. And then there's the question of whether people like to hear it or not. But there's no category for things that are useful and false. What this means is that if you want to end a truth, one way of testing it is to see the impact it has. If it's genuinely useful, then it's a truth. And this is why the Buddha said that his teachings should be put to the test, because this is how you can know if they're true. By seeing what impact they have on your behavior. If you take a teaching and put it into practice, what does it do? What do you do? And what are the results of what you do? If the results really do have a good impact on the mind, that's a truth. For instance, the teachings on karma. They ask you to accept 4 things. 1. There really is such a thing as an action that's done. This is not an illusion, it's not unreal. 2. We are responsible for our actions. In particular, there's a mental event, an intention informed by views, that causes those actions. 3. The action has an effect. And 4. The quality of the effect is determined by the quality of the mind state, causing the action. The Buddha's proof for these principles is: what happens when you put them into action? What difference will they make? Well, think of what would happen if you didn't believe these things, if you felt that your acts didn't really matter, that they really weren't true, that the idea of a good or a bad action was somehow acted on. Imagine the way you'd act. Or if you felt that you could do something, but then hope for some higher being to come along and forgive you and erase the results of that action. How would you act then? If you believe in the principle of action, then you're going to be very careful about what you do. You're going to check the results. Any mistake you make, you can take as a lesson, a mistake here being that you've harmed either yourself or the people around you. That's the way the teaching is tested and put into effect. And you can see the effect. It does have a good impact on the way you act. You become more and more skillful, create less and less suffering for yourself and others. That's how the Buddha proves the principle of action, proves the principle of karma. He doesn't cite his own memories of previous lifetimes or proof that someone can have a consciousness that goes from one life to the next, and then remember what had happened in previous lifetimes. That's not the proof. When people say that all the Buddha's teachings have to be proved in an empirical way, they usually use this as an argument against the principle of karma, against the principle of rebirth. Most people can't remember their past lifetimes, therefore they can't prove the teaching, therefore it's not a relevant teaching, maybe not even Buddhist. That's the line of reasoning. But that kind of empirical proof is not what the Buddha had in mind. His proof is more pragmatic. Take a teaching, put it into effect, and see what results you get. If you get good results, that's a true teaching. But he also has room for what he calls individual truths versus noble truths. Sometimes you hear that the Buddha taught 2 levels of truth, but the only time he makes a distinction between 2 types of truth is this one. Things that are true for you, individually, and things that are true for everybody, across the board. That's one of the meanings of noble, standard, universal, all across the board. As we're meditating, we're trying to sort through the things that are true for us individually, so that ultimately we can get to noble truths, things that are true across the board. That when you meditate you focus on your breath like this or that, it works, it gets good results. In the beginning you're dealing for the most part with individual truths, because sometimes a particular focus or a particular way of conceiving the breath is going to work. For one session, in other words, it works for a particular problem, and the next time you sit down and meditate, it doesn't. That's because you've got a different problem. The old approach may have been true for that particular problem, but new problems pop up time and again. You have to take note of what you learn from each session of sitting or walking meditation, and then test it the next time around. If it doesn't work the second time around, you can chalk it up either to the fact that you weren't observing carefully the rest time, there were things that you missed, or that it was a solution to a different problem, not the problem you're facing now. In this way you begin to build up your body of knowledge, your body of individual truths. But if you work with them skillfully, that they head more and more toward the noble truths. You learn to sort things out in terms of stress and its cause, the path leading to the end of stress, and the actual ending of stress. It's when you hit that last one, which is formally the third noble truth. That's when you know you've hit the noble truths as a whole. You've understood them properly, you've performed the right tasks appropriate to each. Even these truths are active truths. Stress is something the Buddha says to comprehend. Normally we want to run away from it or push it away, but the Buddha says that you've got to comprehend it. If you don't comprehend it, you can't get past it. It's like that riddle of the Sphinx. The Sphinx stands across the road with a riddle. Anyone who comes up and can't answer the Sphinx's riddle gets eaten up. If you can answer the riddle, you get past. It's the same with stress. You've got to be able to answer the riddle of stress so that you can get past it. As the Buddha said, our normal reaction to stress and pain is 1. Bewilderment and 2. A search for a way out. The only way to get beyond your bewilderment is to sit and watch the stress. And the only way you can do that is to put the mind in a position where it doesn't feel threatened by the stress. That's what the path is for, and particularly the heart of the path. Right concentration, putting the mind in a state of ease, even rapture, focused on one thing. This gives the mind a sense of power, a sense of safe haven, a safe place to go. When you have this sense of safe haven, you can begin to probe into things that you'd normally be afraid of. To make another comparison, it's like taming a dragon. If you know you have good strong armor and the dragon's breath can't burn you, then you can get in close to the dragon and end its weak point. This is why concentration is such an important part of the path. It puts you in a position of strength, where you can get intimate with the pain and yet not be anxious. It gives you a sense of confidence that when things get difficult, you don't have to worry. This is one of the reasons why the forest agents recommend going out into the wilderness, for when you get out there, all kinds of things can happen. If you sit there worrying about them, you can't stay. You end up running back. But if you have your wits about you, then you can get the mind into a state of concentration, so that it doesn't zate on all the dangers and problems of being in the wilderness. So that's one level of problem that concentration can help you overcome. Your fears. Second, when difficult things actually happen, that you can withstand them with your concentration. There's a great passage in the Therigatha where the monk is reacting on the fact that he's in some pretty bad pain, he's really sick. What are you going to do? He asks himself. There's no medicine, no doctor, and nobody around to help. As you stay here in the grove, what are you going to do? Are you going to run away? No, he answers, I'm going to stay here, and I'm going to focus on the 4 frames of reference and the 7 factors for awakening. That'll be the mind's protection. In other words, he realizes that his safety lies in looking after the mind. You look after the body to the extent that you can, but then you have to realize that this is a dying body. It's like those cars made with planned obsolescence, it's designed to fall apart at some point. There comes a time when no matter how much you worry about it, how much you try to GHTO a death, the body's still going to go on its own. Your only safety lies in developing these qualities of mind. Sometimes the power of mind can actually heal the body. But there will come times when it can't. Still, at that point it doesn't matter, when the powers of the mind are really strong. So this is why concentration is something you want to develop. Again, sometimes you hear that when you're meditating, being mindful, and a good strong state of concentration comes along, you have to be wary of getting attached to the concentration, so just let it come, let it go. And somehow in that way you transcend the attachment. Well, that's not what the Buddha taught. Concentration is to be developed. You take time, you work at it. Even if it involves a certain amount of attachment, it's attachment to a good thing. It's like holding on to the rungs of a ladder. You don't want to let go of one rung unless you've got your hand on another rung, or you've nearly reached the roof. That's when you can get out of the ladder totally, and you're safe on the roof. As Ajahn Fuang once said, don't be afraid of getting attached to a state of concentration, be afraid that you won't get to the concentration, or that you won't be able to maintain it. Once you're there, once you're attached to it, then you can work on the attachment. So the path is nothing to be feared after all, the Buddha said, the pleasure of concentration is nothing to be feared. It's something to be developed. This is how you prove the truth of his teachings. You work with them and you end that they really do lead to the end of sewering. That's when you've got your proof. Up to that point, things haven't yet been proven. They haven't gone beyond the level of linguistic convention. Certain things will give you a sense of condense, you see results here and there, but only when things open up to the deathless will you have your proof. You've seen sewering stop, and nobody can say that you haven't. That's when you know for sure that what the Buddha taught was true. There is a deathless and it can be attained through human eart. But the teachings require that you, too, be true. You have to be honest in your eart. When your eart doesn't measure up to what the Buddha taught, you can't say that you've proven his teachings false. You've simply chipped away at them a little bit, but you haven't done enough yet to prove them one way or the other. Be honest with yourself, that's how you can really test the path. In other words, as Ajahn Lee once said, to know the truth of the Buddha's teaching, you have to be true, too true in the active sense. Not just knowing true things, but true in your actions. And the proof of your truth comes when you hit the deathless. That's when you know that you can rely on yourself. As the Buddha said, those who have reached the stream in this way will never intentionally do anything wrong, because they've seen the principle of action, the truth of action, and the action of truth. And they'll never intentionally be false again. No preferences. July 20, 2005. The canon tells us that the Buddha's contemporaries fell into two main camps. What you might call absolutists and relativists. The absolutists were the ones who had a theory about the nature of reality, saying that their theory was true and everything else was false. The world is made out of atoms. That's one of their theories. Or, the world is a night, the world is not a night, the world is eternal, the world is not eternal. A long list of views about the world outside. And what those views usually come down to is that it's impossible for human action to have any real impact on things, because the nature of the world is Z. At the other extreme are the relativists. Those who hold that what you say about reality all depends on how you look at things, or who refuse to take any stance at all. Their stance, if you follow it to its logical conclusion, makes it impossible to do anything either, because if the world is totally chaotic, totally random, nothing is really set, nothing is really for certain. What are you going to do? Just muddle around? Some of them advised grabbing whatever pleasure you can, because there's no telling what's going to happen the next moment, the next day down the line. Just now we chanted the Buddha's RST sermon, and you notice that he doesn't start out with either an absolutist or a relativist stance. He's talking about courses of action. He says that if you do this, these are the results. If you indulge in sensuality, these are the results. If you indulge in self-mortification, those are the results, and neither gets any really good results. However, he said, there is a middle path, and it's not a path worked out by reasoning through or applying logic. It was arrived at simply by trying different paths and seeing what worked. He said this middle path is the path that leads to really desirable results. The end of suffering. It gives rise to vision, gives rise to knowledge, brings about peace, knowledge, nibbana. So that's what makes the Buddha's teaching special. He had found a path of action. That's what's worth talking about. Looking at which paths of action lead to suffering, which ones lead to the end of suffering, and then following the one that leads to the end of suffering, whether you like the path or not. There's a poem in China, attributed to the third patriarch, which starts out saying that the great way is not hard for those with no preferences. I don't know what the third patriarch had in mind when he said that, but if you apply it to the Buddha's approach, the only way to make sense of it is this. You do what has to be done, whether you like it or not. There's a sutta where the Buddha denotes wisdom and discernment in terms of how you handle 4 courses of action. The RST2 are the things you like to do that give good results, and the things you don't like to do that give bad results. Those 2 are not hard. They're no-brainers. You avoid the things that you don't like and give bad results, and you do the things you like to do and give good results. It's all very easy. The difficult issues, and the ones that really test your discernment, are the next 2 courses of action. The things you like to do that give bad results, and things you don't like to do that give good results. That's where your preferences get in the way. That's where your preferences make it hard. So you have to learn how to look past your preferences, because there are times when the path really does require a lot of effort. You may say to yourself, I don't want to do this, I don't like this, and you wriggle around and ND all kinds of excuses, but in the end what happens? You don't get the results you want, because you've made it hard for yourself. Sometimes you have the other attitude, the macho attitude, and yet there are aspects of the path that require just watching, being very patient, very still. Your macho side may not like that. As for the things you like to do, you say I don't see what's wrong with this. You make all kinds of excuses and, again, in the end, you don't get the results you want. This is one of those areas where each person has to develop his or her own discernment. How are you going to get past your preferences? The only way is to look at the situation and to try out various things to see what works. When you ND what works, then whether you like it or not, you follow it. If your preferences complain, figure out ways of dealing with them to put them aside. Discernment doesn't mean just seeing the right course of action, it also involves mastering the right way to put your preferences aside. Remind yourself that your preferences have gotten in the way, have gummed up the works, for a long time. How much longer are you going to side with them? And how do you put them aside? Learn to observe them and see how they arise and pass away. See how they're not self, that you don't have to identify with them. When you see something and a sense of liking or a disliking arises, you don't have to get involved. When the liking and disliking have nobody to play with, they go away. It's like that other Zen conundrum, the sound of one hand. When the liking comes up and you don't respond, that's the sound of one hand. Once you get down to doing what simply has to be done, the path gets a lot easier. In other words, you're not adding difficulties on top of it. If you don't make it unnecessarily difficult, it's pretty manageable. Look at the elements of the path. It doesn't contain anything superhuman, anything that requires you to exhaust yourself. In fact, a lot of the path lies in learning how to husband your energy so that you don't waste it on unskillful things. When you don't waste it on unskillful things, you've got extra energy for the skillful ones. So on the days when the situation really does require that you sit for a long period of time to work through a difficult issue, you've got the energy to draw on, because you didn't fritter it away with trivial pursuits. In particular, you haven't frittered it away trying to justify your preferences. This is the way life is. It's going to present you with difficult situations many times, whether you want them or not. If you can put yourself in the mood where you're up for whatever arises, things are a lot easier. The day is going to come when your death is going to stare you right in your face, and of course most people don't want that. They run away and they try to wiggle out of it in all kinds of ways, yet the more they wiggle, the worse things get. But if you've been following the path with no regard for your preferences, then when death comes you can tell yourself, this is what I've been practicing for all this time, so let's do it right this time. Memories of your life will start arising at that point, and you'll see things you're going to miss, things you regret having done. You can't let yourself get involved with those things, for they make things harder. This is why we sit here pulling the mind away from its distractions. When you die there are going to be monstrous distractions, and they're going to pull you strongly in their direction right when you're at your weakest. If you simply give in to them, it's going to have a major impact on how your rebirth is going to go. If you can maintain your calm center in the midst of whatever comes up, things will be a lot easier. Bad things will come up, good things will come up, so you'll want to maintain your center. Don't get excited by the good things. Don't get upset by the bad. It sounds like meditation instructions, but it's also death instructions. How to die properly. Death is easy for those with no preferences, and one aspect of this great way we're practicing here is getting ready for that fact. Life, of course, is a lot easier if you have no preferences, too. This doesn't mean that you don't have any goals or desires at all, simply that you do what has to be done. If, when you sit down, your mind is a mess, you don't say, well, today is a bad day to meditate, I'm going to wait until some other time. You learn how to sit with a mind that's a mess, and begin to see the little threads of the possibility of finding some peace in the midst of the mess. When you can do that, you've learned a really important lesson, a much more important lesson than if you say, well, things are bad, so I'm just not going to tackle them. That doesn't teach you any lessons at all. The mind may not settle down as much as you'd like, but at least you've learned some important skills in how to deal with difficult situations. You may think, I don't want a difficult situation right now, but there it is. What are you going to do? You do your best. And you figure out what is the best you can do, given the situation. Then there are the times when things are easy. The mind settles down quickly and is very still, and the mind says, okay, what's next? Let's move on to insight. Well, maybe you have to get your concentration solid before you're really ready to develop insight. There are many examples of people who have gotten a little bit of stillness and wanted to jump straight for insight and end up jumping right over the cliff. So wherever you are on the path, you do what has to be done. Don't let your preferences get in the way. When you can manage that, then it's not a question of being easy or difficult. You just do what has to be done. When you develop that attitude that you're willing to do what has to be done, you get the results you want. And sometimes the results are better than what you could have ever thought of wanting. Licking yourself clean. May 25, 2005. The Buddha once said that one of the prerequisites for concentration is a sense of comfort, ease, and well-being, both physical and mental. One of the reasons we recite those chants on goodwill, compassion, appreciation, and equanimity is to create a sense of well-being in the mind. Thoughts of goodwill are good thoughts to think. They feel good. They put the mind at ease. You don't have to struggle with anybody. You don't have to settle any old scores. It feels good to be thinking good thoughts. It helps put you in the right mood to meditate. Physically, you work RST with your posture. You want to sit straight. You don't want to lean over or sit hunched over. Keep your back straight, comfortably straight. Then you work with the breath. Does the breath feel good? Notice where exactly you feel the breath, which parts of the body have sensations that let you know that now the breath is coming in, now the breath is going out. How do those sensations feel? Are they tight, restricted? If they are, think of their loosening up a little bit. Or do they get tight at a particular spot in the breath cycle? You may want to shorten the breath or lengthen it. Approach this as you would any skill. You learn from your mistakes. One of the RST things you learn as you work with the breath is that you're clumsy. You tend to put too much pressure on it. You approach it with an attitude that's too controlling or too tight. But that doesn't mean you should stop working with the breath. It's like the RST time you sit down to play the piano. You sit down and realize you can't play Beethoven. There are 3 ways of reacting to that. One is to get up and never touch the piano again. Another is to keep playing 433, the John Cage piece where you just sit at the piano and don't do anything at all. And the other is to keeping practicing, starting with simple pieces. Learn to listen to your playing, see what you can improve, and gradually get better and better until you can play Beethoven. This is how piano playing becomes a skill. This is how any skill gets developed. You explore that boundary line between what you can control and what you can't. The way to explore it is by poking here, adjusting there, knowing that you probably will make some mistakes, but not getting too worried about it because you learn from your mistakes. Over time you get more and more sensitive to exactly how much control is too much, how much is too little, and you develop a wide range of techniques. When there's pain in the body, what's the best way to breathe? When you're tired, what's the best way to breathe? When you're tense, what's the best way to breathe? These are things you can explore. The whole point of this is that in the course of doing these things, you develop your own sensitivity as to what works and what doesn't. Your standards for what works and what doesn't get more renewed. This is how discernment gets developed in the practice. It's not a matter of reading a few books, getting a few ideas, and then cloning your mind to those ideas so that you see things as they're described in the books. That's not discernment. It's just adding one more layer of perceptions on top of the layers you already have. Discernment comes from your ability to see the mind in action and to be sensitive as to when the mind's actions are giving good results and when they aren't. You have to be your own judge. In other words, instead of throwing all the responsibility onto the texts or onto the teachers, you take on the job of learning to be a good judge of your actions. Ajahn Fuang once said that meditators tend to be like little puppies. They go out and defecate and then come running to their mothers to have their mothers lick them oa. They haven't learned how to lick themselves oa yet. So as a meditator you need to learn how to lick yourself oa. If things don't go well, learn how to pick yourself up, dust yourself oa, and then gurr out what went wrong. Take responsibility for your meditation. Take responsibility for your insights. This is what the Buddha did. This is what every meditator has to do. If you go to a teacher, saying you've had a certain experience, and the teacher identifies it as a level of jhana or a level of insight, can you be sure? Do you really want to hand those judgments over to somebody else? Or do you want to learn how to judge things on your own, so that you can trust yourself? If you let the other people do the judging, there's always going to be an element of doubt. Do they know what they're saying? At the same time, you're absolving yourself of any responsibility. Discernment becomes their duty and not yours. That's not a good attitude for a meditator to take. You've got to learn to look, to try a few things. For instance, what is it like just to let the breath come in and out on its own? What is it going to do? Figure out how to watch it. Then gurr out how to nudge it, what to think in order to make it more comfortable. Then gurr out how to judge the results. This is how discernment is developed, how meditation becomes a skill. As it becomes more and more of a skill, you become more sensitive to even the slightest bit of discomfort both in the body and in the mind. That's how you see the Four Noble Truths. You see stress, you see how it's caused, you connect it to your own actions. You see what you do or don't do that lets the stress be shed away. So think of the meditation as an experiment, something you try. You're trying to prove a hypothesis. That you can put an end to sewering. Now, scientists like to see their hypothesis proved, but good scientists are willing to admit when it isn't, when the experiment actually proves something else. You chalk it up to experience and you try again. The instructions for breath meditation involve discernment, and they also involve training yourself. To train in any skill you need the desire to actually do the practice, and you have to be open and aboveboard about that. Don't try to deny the fact that there's desire. Just learn how to use it skillfully. Then there has to be persistence. You stick with the practice. Try it again and again and again. But persistence is not just a matter of the hours you put in. You also have to be intent, to pay very careful attention to what you're doing, what the results are. Finally, you need to use your intelligence, which means using ingenuity and being discerning in what works, what doesn't, and how you might try to improve on both. These 4 qualities are called the bases for success. They're essential to any skill. So approach the meditation as a skill. Remember how you learned skills in the past. If it was music or art, a sport, carpentry, whatever. How did you go about mastering that skill? A lot of times you made mistakes. You noticed that they were mistakes, but you didn't give up. You went back and tried it over again, trying to observe what you did wrong, what you did right, what worked and what didn't. Over time, your hands, which originally seemed to be all thumbs, gradually became human hands. A carpenter's hands, a violinist's hands. And your mind became a craftsman's mind. You reached a point where you didn't have to go running to somebody else to pass judgment on whether you did it right or not. You began to know yourself whether it was right or not. That's when you really mastered the skill. The same principle applies to the breath. We spend so much of our lives being desensitized to the breath energy in the body, how we actually feel the body from within. We've been so intent on learning other things outside that, to make room for them, we've blocked out this part of our awareness. Now's the time to back up and get more sensitive to this area of your awareness again, to see how it feels, to see how your perceptions of what the breath does are going to affect how the breath actually oozes through the body. Experiment to see how you can work both with the breath and with the perceptions of the breath to make it more comfortable, so that you've got that prerequisite for the mind to settle down and get concentrated. A sense of ease, a sense of well-being. The body sitting here seems to have a nice of energy throughout. It's not blocked. The blood seems to be owing through all parts of the body. Your focus isn't interfering with it. You feel good just sitting here. The amount of pressure you put on the present moment is just right. Not too light, not too heavy. That's something that comes with practice. So, pay careful attention to what you're doing, because that's how you learn. That's how the meditation becomes your own. The end of uncertainty. May 5, 2005. Very few things in life are certain. Even the thoughts we know to be true. To what extent are they really true? If you think of truth as the correspondence between your thought and the thing it represents, no thought can be totally true. Each thought is just a sketch. There's no one thought that can comprehend all the many levels of truth out there. Each thought is just an approximation. So the question turns from representation to one of pragmatism. To what extent is the approximation useful? It may leave a lot out, it may not really encompass the thing, but if it serves a purpose, the thought is useful. The question then is, what's the best purpose for thoughts to serve? That's where you have to look for a truth that's not just a thought, something you really can be certain about in and of itself. And there's really only one truth that can pass that test, only one truth you really can be certain about, and that's when there's suffering and when there's not. You don't have to ask. If you experience it, you know. And right there is where the Buddha staked all of his teachings. Suffering arising, suffering passing away. Everything else he taught is arranged around that, even right view. It's right to the extent that it helps put an end to suffering. Your thoughts are skillful or unskillful, your words and your deeds are skillful and unskillful, depending on the extent to which they put an end to suffering. So always keep this principle in mind as thoughts come in and out of your mind. You may have heard that the Buddha taught, say, that there is no self. To what extent is the non-self teaching skillful? Where is it not skillful? Those are the questions he would have you look at, not the question of whether there is or is not a self. There are a lot of things that could be true, but this may not be the right time to think about those things. The Buddha has a teaching on right speech, where he says that speech can be true or not true, being silent or not being silent, welcome or unwelcome. He said to speak only those things that are true and being silent. And as for the question of whether they're welcome or not welcome, He said look for the right time and place to speak. The same principle applies to our thoughts. There's a time and a place for different types of thinking. There are times when having a strong sense of self is very useful, very beneficial, and other times when it's precisely the thing that gets in the way. The question is, how do you know? And the answer is, through trial and error, something we don't like to hear. We'd like to have a nice formula set out. Sometimes the Buddha does set out a formula for us, but in many areas he doesn't, precisely because it's more important for us to gain our own sensitivity to our thoughts and their results. When you think something, what happens as a result? And particularly, to what extent does it cause stress? That's what you've got to look into, and that's why we're meditating here. To get a greater sense of sensitivity as to what's causing stress in our minds, to see how it's not necessary, to see how we can let go of the cause. Then, when there seems to be relief, keep watching it for a while, because there may still be some stress in there. The Buddha maps things out in terms of levels of stress. Even in the practice of right concentration, there are levels of stress. Just because the mind seems still doesn't mean that the job is done. Even when there's a great sense of luminosity or of all-encompassing awareness, the job may not be over. You've got to learn how to keep looking. I've known some people who have been through the sort of education that aims at fostering self-esteem, and the problem with that is that it fosters complacency. It teaches them not to learn how to judge the results of their actions. Everything they do is supposed to be good, a cause for self-esteem, and yet they may be doing a lot of harm. So the important thing is for them to learn how to be sensitive to the harm that comes from their thoughts, words, and deeds. This applies not only outwardly, but also inwardly, in the practice of meditation. When you do something, look for the results. When you say something, look for the results. When you think something, look for the results. When you work with the breath, look for the results. Breath training is an especially good way to learn how to be sensitive to the results of your thinking. There are different ways of focusing on the breath, different ways of conceiving the breath, different ways of dealing with the hindrances. And your job is to learn how to be sensitive to the results of those ways, to figure out which way of focusing is right for right now, which way of thinking is right for right now, which way of being still is right for right now. There are some guidelines, but the most important thing is to learn how to judge for yourself, for without that sensitivity, there's no way you're going to see the really subtle levels of stress in the mind. This is where and why we have to be observant. When the Buddha talks about developing mindfulness and concentration, he places a lot of emphasis on alertness. In the few places where he actually denies alertness, he points to being alert to what you're doing. In the body, when you move your hand, be alert to the fact that you're moving your hand. When you look left, look right, be alert to the fact that you're looking left, looking right. Then moving into the mind. When there are feelings, be alert to what you're doing in the feeling, in the perception, in the thought fabrication, in the consciousness. Each of these things contains an element of fabrication, an element of present intention. Do you ever notice that? Do you see it happening? If you can't yet see it happening, look at what you can see that you're adding to the present moment. And be sensitive at the same time to any sense of stress there. See what you can do to minimize the stress, for only when you learn how to minimize the stress that you can see, do you start becoming sensitive to the subtler levels. In this way you'll learn how to be a connoisseur of your actions, and particularly a connoisseur of actions and events in the mind. A connoisseur of food has to develop a very keen palate, a connoisseur of music, a very keen ear. What you're trying to do is to develop a keen sensitivity to what's going on in the mind. This requires a whole cluster of mature attitudes concerning how you respond when you do things right, when you do things wrong, so that you can learn from when you've done things right and done things wrong. If you get depressed over a mistake, that's unskillful. Notice that. If you get careless after doing something right, notice that as well. The Buddha doesn't tell you not to take pride in being skillful. Actually, a sense of pride, a sense of satisfaction when you've done something right, is an important inducement in the path. It gives you the juice you need to keep going. But you've got to be sensitive to when and where that sense of pride turns into carelessness. The same when you do things wrong. You have to recognize when you've made a mistake, but you can't let that recognition become debilitating. Again, learn to be sensitive to the spot where the recognition of a mistake leads to unskillful reactions, and learn to cut it off at the pass. As you get more sensitive to the results of your actions and to the alternatives open to you, you don't have to follow through on unskillful patterns of thought. As the Buddha said, if you had to stick with the patterns or habits you already have, there would be no sense in teaching you. It wouldn't do any good. He says it's because people can learn to be more skillful. That's why he taught. So learn to be alert to what you're doing, alert to the results of what you're doing. Even a simple thing like focusing on the breath is an important way to develop your powers of alertness, your powers of evaluation and judgment. Learn to be a connoisseur of your breathing, and then a connoisseur of the thinking that goes around the breath. That's when you end yourself arriving at something really certain, even more certain than the arising and passing away of sewering. It's the total ending of sewering. That's when you know for sure that you've done things right. There's nothing more certain than that. Habits of perception. November 27, 2004. What have you got here in the present moment? You've got the body, you've got the breath, you've got thoughts, and you've got your awareness. But you're also carrying a lot of habits. In fact, this is the main issue in the meditation. If you didn't have certain habits of perception, you wouldn't be creating sewering for yourself right now. You may not seem to be sewering much, but there's always some stress that you're creating through a lack of skill. And this is precisely what we're trying to uncover as we meditate. Some of the baggage you're bringing into the present moment consists of issues you've picked up in the course of the day. Things this person said, that person did, things you yourself said or did. In some cases it's as if you've been a garbage collector, gathering up the day's trash. If you're going to get any peace in the next hour, you've got to throw it out. But the issues also go deeper than that. If that were the only issue, you could go and live alone where you wouldn't have to interact with people, and that would be the end of the problem. But it's not the end of the problem. When you go to live by yourself, the habits of the mind start looming even larger. The less contact you have with people, the more likely your habits are to go out of bounds. You can get into some really weird feedback loops when you're living alone. So the Buddha sets out maps, he sets out instructions for how to cut through those feedback loops and to understand how your perceptions shape things in a way that brings sewering. He also shows you how to perceive things in a new way that will end those habits and cut through that sewering, so that ultimately when there's a perception of the breath or any of the sensory input you have in the present moment, there's no sewering added on. The input is the only disturbance you have. There's no greed, anger, or delusion to muck up the works. As the Buddha said, the problem all comes down to ignorance. Ignorance of what? Ignorance of the Four Noble Truths, and he's not talking about not having read about the Four Noble Truths. All of us here have read about them and thought about them. Ignorance means not seeing things in terms of the Four Noble Truths. We see things in other terms, the big ones being our sense of self, our sense of the things that belong to us, and our sense of the reality of the world out there, what exists, what doesn't exist out there. Once we place our faith in these perceptions, we become a slave to them. Our idea of objective reality places a lot of imperatives on us. Our idea of who we are places a lot of imperatives on us, and these are the imperatives that make us doer. So the Buddha teaches us to learn how to question those perceptions. There's a passage where he talks about how people are a slave to a duality, or a polarity between existence and non-existence. Does the world out there really exist? Does it not really exist? He advises learning how to avoid that polarity by simply watching things arising and passing away in the present moment. Stay just at that level and don't get involved in the question of whether there's anything lying behind the mere experience of arising and passing away. And the best way to do that is to give yourself a framework. This is what the four establishings of mindfulness or four frames of reference are all about. Giving yourself a framework so that you're not blown away by the events of the world. See things within the frame of body, feelings, mind states, or mental qualities, in and of themselves. Make those your frames of reference as when you're dealing with the breath right now. Just the breath coming in, going out. In this context, thoughts have meaning only to the extent that they pull you away from the breath, or don't pull you away from the breath. While you're sitting here, ideally that's the only question. How the thoughts impinge on the breath. Thoughts that are useful in keeping you with the breath are the ones you want to encourage. Thoughts that pull you away, you want to let go. In the Buddha's words, you abandon greed and distress with reference to the world here being the world of the senses. Only when you abandon greed and distress with reference to these things can you look at how they're directly experienced. See how sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and tactile sensations are experienced right here in the present moment, in and of themselves. If you can watch these things arising and passing away simply in and of themselves, the whole issue of what exists out there or what doesn't exist out there gets put aside. As you watch things arise, the idea that there's nothing out there doesn't occur to you. As you watch them pass away, the idea that there's something out there permanent, lasting, existing independently of you, doesn't occur to you either. You see that the issues of existence and non-existence matter only if you make them an issue. The Buddha's not saying that things do or don't exist out there, it's just that in this mental state the issue doesn't occur to you. This is the mental state you want to develop, because all that's left is simply the issue of the arising and passing away of stress and suffering. That gets you right in line with the Four Noble Truths and their imperatives. The imperative to comprehend suffering, abandon its cause, realize its cessation, and develop the path leading to its cessation. These imperatives, unlike those of the world, are liberating, which is why you want to take them on. The RST1 is to comprehend suffering, so that you can begin to see what you're doing to give rise to the suffering. This is what focuses you on the real job at hand. You start seeing the fabrication of worlds in the mind, realizing that the world as you perceive it out there is really your own mental construct. You have lots of different mental constructs about the world out there. Sometimes you think about the world in geological terms, sometimes in cosmic astronomical terms, sometimes simply in terms of your own personal narrative, day to day. There are many different levels that are useful for different purposes. You want to put yourself in the state of mind where you can choose which view of the world is useful right here, right now, so you're not a slave to the imperatives that these different views put on you. The same with your notion of self. Is there a self? Is there no self? The Buddha says, don't ask. So much of our life depends on the idea of who we are. If you really look at the arising and passing away of your sense of self, seeing how it's a construct just the way your sense of the world is a construct, then you're in a much better position. You can use different ideas of the self to function in different ways, and then drop them when they're no longer useful. But all this is possible only if you keep in mind as your basic framework the question of what gives rise to suffering, what kind of action doesn't give rise to suffering, or what kind of action leads you to the end of suffering. The basic framework of the Four Noble Truths, seeing your experience in those terms, rather than in terms of the world or the self. Then you can see the activities that you do, the fabrications you make, bodily, verbal, and mental, simply as strategies, useful or not, skillful or not, in line with the imperatives of those four truths. And that's liberating. On the one hand, that you can function a lot more skillfully as you open up to the idea that there might be more courses of action open to you than you had imagined. If you have a very definite idea of who you are or the type of person you are, you place limits on what you can do. If you have very set ideas about the world out there, that, too, limits what you can do in terms of putting an end to suffering and stress. So what we're trying to do as we meditate here is give ourselves the frame of reference from which we can call into question our habitual ideas of the world, our habitual ideas of the self, to see how both of them are fabrications made out of the way we look at things, the way we attend to things, the way we perceive things. Similarly with the intentions that are based on those ways of looking at the world, looking at the self. We can start calling them into question, looking for alternatives, testing alternatives, with the overriding concern of seeing what we can do to put an end to all the stress and suffering we're causing through our unskillful intentions. As you look at your experience in these terms, the constant questioning of what you're doing and what results you're getting out of what you do, you can open yourself to whole new dimensions inside. You can use your ingenuity to glean out new ways of acting, new ways of interacting with your perceptions of the world, new ways of interacting with your perceptions of self, that free you from the stress and suffering that deep down inside you think are a necessary part of being a human being. This is so much of what the Buddha's teaching is about. Freeing you from your own self-imposed limitations. Think of all those people who told young Prince Siddhartha that there was no way he could put an end to suffering. The best people in the history of the world have all suffered in this way, they said, so who are you to say that it's not necessary? Still, the prince said there must be some other way. He had the ability to imagine that there would be another way, and the guts to devote his life to ending if it were true. And Nelly he found that, yes, what he conceived as a possibility wasn't just a leap of the imagination. It was an actuality. This opened a vast new range of possibilities for the whole human race of what a human being can do. Take, for instance, his analysis of the 4 types of action. Most people would only think of the RST3. Things that give rise to good results within the normal course of the world, things that give rise to bad, things that give rise to mixed results. But the Buddha found that there was another kind of action that leads to the end of action, to the end of suffering. That was his great discovery. Notice, it was a kind of action he discovered, based on certain views, based on certain perceptions, based on certain ways of looking at experience, and then following through in line with them. So as we're practicing meditation, remember that perception and attention, the way we perceive things, the questions we ask about the things we perceive are the 2 main issues we have to focus on. This is one of the reasons we put so much emphasis on concentration, for the levels of concentration are perception attainments. Can you hold on to a particular perception so that the mind can really settle there? See what it does to your experience. When you stick with the perception of the breath as ling the body, what does that do to the physical sense of the breath? When you perceive the breath as being able to come in and out of the body anywhere at all, what does that do? What effect does it have on the mind? When you get to the formless perceptions, such as a night space, what in the realm of your experience right here corresponds to a night space, a night consciousness, nothingness, neither perception nor non-perception? We investigate these things to see the power of perception, so that ultimately we can let it go. So this is a very important thing to focus on as you meditate and as you go through the course of the day. How you perceive things. You can begin with simply how you perceive your interactions with other people. Notice how much of your perception of the situation is just that, your perception. We talk about the garbage we collect in the course of the day. How much of that garbage is self-produced? To put it really crudely, how much of it is just your own shit that you're carrying around? This is not to say that other people aren't behaving in evil, outrageous, or horrible ways. There are people like that in the world, but if your peace of mind were totally dependent on everybody else's behaving themselves, you'd be their slave. You'd never get free. But as the Buddha said, the whole issue of suffering is something we can overcome through our own efforts. This means that we have to look at the suffering we create for ourselves. As for what other people are doing, that's their responsibility. It doesn't have to impinge on us. And as for the baggage we carry around, if we had to go back and straighten out all the horrible things we did in the past before we could gain awakening, we'd never be done. But it turns out that when you simply learn to drop old habits, awakening is possible. After all, the suffering you're experiencing right now is a combination of things coming from the past and things you're doing right now, including the way you're perceiving things right now. A frequent image in meditation instructions is that all you have to do is turn on a light, and the darkness goes away. No matter how many eons the darkness has reigned, all you have to do is turn on the light once, and that's the end of the darkness. All you have to do is work on how you're perceiving things in the present moment, and when things nearly click, you don't have to worry about what other people tell you, you don't have to worry about the world, you don't have to worry about the self, you don't have to worry about what you've done in the past, for you've learned a new habit, you've developed a new skill. And the development of that new skill changes everything. A multilingual mind. April 2, 2005. One of the things you notice in meditation as you start looking at your thoughts, looking at your feelings, looking at sensory input, is that the solidity of your world starts dissolving away, both your sense of the world outside and your sense of yourself inside. And in some cases, just that much feels liberating, free from the heavy burdens you normally carry around. You begin to see that the heaviness is something you yourself have invested these things with. But that lack of solidity is not total liberation. The reason we want to let things seem less solid in this way is so that we can see patterns we'd otherwise miss. You notice that when the Buddha summarizes the essence of his awakening, at least the part that's worth teaching, worth passing on, he focuses on the principle of causality, the connection between things. In particular, he focuses on the connections between what he calls name and form on one hand and consciousness on the other. Starting with this connection, he points out how suaring is built on top of it. The important elements of name and form are contact and intention. The way you regard the contact is another element of name and form, called attention. But here contact means not only contact at the senses, but also contact among different things going on in mind. From that kind of contact you make choices, you make up your mind, you want to do this, you want to do that. You have an intention that leads to actions. The Buddha wants you to see this. This is the process of fabrication. This is how we create our worlds, how we create our sense of self. And he wants you to look at it directly as it's happening. The reason we don't see it is because we divide things up into things that exist, things that don't exist, ourself, and what lies outside of ourself. This set of distinctions tends to point our attention away from what we're directly experiencing. The things we experience. Do they really exist? Do they not exist? In other words, is there something lying behind them? Is there nothing lying behind them? This kind of questioning pulls our attention away from what we're experiencing to focus on what we assume is either out there behind it or not out there behind it. We end ourselves placing our trust in things we don't even see, can't even experience. The same with the distinction between self and things outside ourselves. When something is inside of ourself, we don't observe it very well. We identify with it. It's like putting your foot into a shoe. Your foot starts getting shaped by the shoe without you really noticing it. As for things outside of yourself, you're not really responsible for them. They don't matter so much. That's your attitude. So both of these ways of looking at things pull your attention away from what the Buddha said is the real issue. How your intentions give rise to suaring, how the process of fabrication gives rise to suaring. He wants you to look at these things as a process so that you can understand the patterns. The RST step is to see what kinds of fabrication are blatantly unskillful, so that you can learn how to drop them. And then as your sensitivity to the idea of skillful and unskillful gets more and more reneged, you end yourself dropping more and more reneged things. Ultimately you can drop the whole process of fabrication altogether. But RST, we have to start with blatant things. This is why we start with the breath. What kind of breathing is skillful breathing? What kind of breathing is unskillful breathing? What kinds of perceptions are skillful? What kinds are unskillful? The breath and the questions about the breath are all elements in the process of fabrication. When you're talking to yourself as you meditate, what kind of talking is skillful? What kind of talking is not? The meditation points you right to this level and asks you to drop your other levels of analyzing, other levels of looking at experience, because looking at the process of fabrication as it's happening is where you're going to see what you really need to see. What is the cause? What is the effect? Which causes are better than other causes? which EX are better than other EX. This is why the Buddha's most important teachings are the Four Noble Truths, because they point to cause and effect. Skillful cause and unskillful cause, desirable effect and undesirable effect. Simple, very basic terms. Pleasure, pain, ease and stress, happiness and suffering. These are things we've known since even before we could verbalize anything, but we haven't understood them. So the Buddha is trying to get you to pull the mind down to that pre-verbal level as much as you can. That becomes your basis for looking at things, for mastering the processes of breathing, thinking, and perceiving, so that you can put these processes to the ideal purpose, which is narrowly to go beyond all of them. So try to get to this basic level where you're just looking at the building blocks. The very basic actions that then get constructed into larger and larger patterns as you're looking at your breath, as you're going out and functioning in the world. When you don't have any other duties, you can simply watch the process of how the eye and forms meet, and then the way you comment on them, the way you direct your eyes to look at certain things in certain ways. That's a process too. You want to be able to shift in and out of that mode, because if you work in this mode all day long you wouldn't be able to function at work, wouldn't be able to get along with people. But if you're good at shifting in and out of these modes, dealing on the level of people when you need to, dealing on the level of the building blocks when you have the opportunity, you learn a lot of interesting lessons about how the mind works. Where the elements that lead to unskillfulness, lack of mindfulness, lack of discernment, lack of concentration come in. You begin to catch them. It's like learning another language. You don't forget your original language, it's just that you learn how to function on another level, in a new context. And people who become bilingual begin to notice that they have a separate personality in the other language, a separate sense of how the world works in the other language. The process of becoming skilled in the other language is a very good lesson in learning how to take things apart in a new way, seeing processes as they happen. Then you turn around and you have a new perspective on your original language as well. So we're training the mind here to be multilingual, able to function in many different contexts, and in particular getting good at this context of simply looking at the processes without worrying about what entities do or don't lie behind them, or about which part of the process is you and which part is not. The question here is which activities are skillful and which ones are unskillful. Learn to look at things as activities, as events in a causal chain. And this is not just a game of perception, because it has a really good purpose. Release, total freedom. That's what you can gain as you learn to look at things simply from the perspective of what leads to what, which actions lead to which results. That way you learn to see things that you never before really thought of as actions, simply as actions, as part of a causal chain. That's one of the things that the Buddha means by the word emptiness. You don't load this causal chain down with your preconceived notions or the constructs you tend to build around it. Instead, you learn how to see events simply as that. As events, empty of any other questions that would pull you in other directions. In keeping with the Buddha's teachings, we underscore the profound significance of disseminating wisdom extensively. Today, we've converted this voluminous 1,000-page tome into an easily accessible audio format. Now, the responsibility to further this noble cause rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and content shares, you play a pivotal role in the widespread distribution of these teachings, benefiting countless others. Let's uphold the age-old tradition of sharing knowledge and fostering mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We invite you to join us in this mission, and together, we can create a profound impact on the lives of many.